For a show about 7 people who never actually leave a lagoon, Gilligan's Island has traveled an awfully long way. It has survived cancellation, a scheduling ambush by Gunsmoke, 3 theme songs, and 60 years of reruns that never seem to stop looping. Ask almost anyone born after 1970 to name the 7 castaways and they'll rattle off the list without thinking, the way you'd recite the alphabet. That's the strange power of syndication. A show that lasted only 3 seasons on network television has effectively never left the air since, running in an endless afternoon loop from the Nixon administration straight through to streaming platforms in 2026. But not every episode made that journey intact. Buried inside the show's cheerful, coconut-scented run are a handful of half-hours that television has quietly tried to forget, episodes that get skipped over on streaming platforms, trimmed for syndication packages, or left off best of marathons entirely, year after year, without anyone ever officially explaining why. They were never the subject of a formal government ban or a courtroom order. Nothing so dramatic. There was no press conference, no censorship board, no headline announcing their disappearance. What happened instead was quieter and, in its own way, more telling. The industry itself decided these episodes were more trouble than they were worth and slowly edged them toward the exit. The same way a family quietly stops bringing up an old joke that used to get laughs and now just gets an awkward silence. This is actually a familiar pattern in American television history, even if Gilligan's Island rarely gets mentioned alongside the more famous examples. Looney Tunes shorts built on wartime and racial caricature vanished from broadcast rotation decades ago without a formal recall. Certain Speedy Gonzales cartoons spent years in a kind of syndication limbo. Even Amos and Andy, once one of the most popular programs in the country, effectively disappeared from television entirely by the mid-1960s. Gilligan's Island never reached that level of controversy, and nothing here rises to that level either, but the same quiet mechanism was at work on a much smaller scale. A handful of scenes trimmed here, an episode conveniently missing from a box set there, and eventually the gaps start to form a pattern of their own. Today we're looking at 3 of the clearest examples of that pattern, and once you see what's actually happening in each one, it won't be hard to understand why they've spent the last several decades drifting further and further from the spotlight. Airing in the fall of 1965, right in the thick of America's anxiety about Latin American coups and Cold War brinkmanship, the little dictator drops an exiled strongman named Pancho Hernando González Enríquez Rodriguez onto the island. Within minutes of arriving, Rodriguez pulls a gun, declares himself absolute ruler of the castaways' tiny patch of sand, and begins issuing decrees. He appoints Gilligan as his puppet president, a smiling figurehead meant to make the takeover look legitimate, while Rodriguez pulls every string from behind the throne. It's broad, cartoonish satire, closer to a vaudeville sketch than a political thriller, and by most accounts Sherwood Schwartz himself considered it one of his favorite scripts of the entire series. That's exactly what makes it uncomfortable in hindsight. The episode is essentially a parody of the kind of Banana Republic coup that was, at that very moment, playing out for real across Central and South America. The mid-1960s were littered with actual exiled presidents, actual juntas, and actual American anxiety about which strongman might align with Washington and which might align with Moscow. A sitcom joking about a puppet dictator with a funny accent landed very differently to audiences who had just watched real headlines about real coups than it does to us now, decades removed from that specific fear. Watch it today and the jokes about a small, absurd man seizing total power through a fake Democratic front hit a very different nerve than they did in 1965, not because the writing changed, but because the world around it did. There's also the matter of Rodriguez himself, played with big, theatrical flair by Nehemiah Persoff, an actor who spent much of the decade playing foreign menace roles regardless of the character's actual nationality. The performance is entertaining, but it's also a textbook example of how 60s television treated Latin American politics as a costume rather than a country. Broad accents, mustache, medals pinned to a uniform that means nothing, and a plot that never bothers to specify which nation Rodriguez actually ruled. The island itself is given a name for the first time in the entire series specifically for this episode, Iquarico West, a fictional stand-in that lets the writers borrow every visual cliché of a Latin American banana republic without ever having to be accountable to an actual country, an actual history, or an actual people. The episode's centerpiece is a dream sequence in which Gilligan imagines himself as the puppet dictator of a nation collapsing into chaos around him. Invading armies at the border, ships sinking in the harbor, his own cabinet of castaways-turned-ministers begging him to look out the window and see the disaster he's presiding over. It's clever construction, and by most accounts it really was Sherwood Schwartz's favorite script of the series, the one episode he pointed to when critics accused the show of having nothing to say. In a strange way, that's part of the problem. The dream sequence works precisely because it's staged like a genuine political nightmare, the kind of imagery lifted straight from real newsreels about real coups in Cuba, the Dominican Republic, and half a dozen other nations whose governments were being propped up, toppled, or quietly managed by outside powers throughout the decade. A sitcom borrowing that imagery for laughs plays very differently once you know how many real families were living through the version of that nightmare that wasn't a dream at all. For a show that loved poking fun at Cold War paranoia, The Little Dictator is one of the few episodes where the satire and the stereotype are impossible to fully separate. It's funny, and it's also a fairly blunt cartoon of an entire hemisphere's political turmoil, which is precisely why revival packages and streaming rotations tend to quietly slide past it in favor of safer, sillier fare, the kind of episode that shows up on a DVD box set with a commentary track explaining its historical context, but rarely gets pulled into a casual afternoon rerun block anymore. If The Little Dictator is about geopolitics filtered through slapstick, Voodoo is about something even touchier: the show's habit of treating entire belief systems as punchlines. The premise is simple enough. Gilligan stumbles into a cave full of native relics that the professor identifies as Mayan in origin, despite the island supposedly sitting somewhere in the South Pacific, a geographic contradiction nobody in the writer's room seemed to mind. Unbeknownst to the castaways, a witch doctor is living in that same cave, and he does not appreciate house guests. He begins carving voodoo dolls of all 7 castaways, pricking Gilligan in the neck from a distance, hexing the girls with matching curses, and eventually turning the professor, the show's resident man of science, into a shuffling, blank-eyed zombie. On its surface, this is classic Gilligan's Island, a supernatural threat, a skeptical professor who insists there's a rational explanation, and a series of increasingly silly attempts to break the spell. What has aged far less gracefully is the character at the center of it. The witch doctor is presented exactly the way 60s television usually presented spiritual traditions from outside the Western world, as sinister, cartoonish, and fundamentally untrustworthy, a menace to be defeated rather than a person to be understood. His culture isn't named with any specificity. His motivations are reduced to evil for evil's sake, and the entire practice of voodoo, a real and complex religious tradition with roots in West Africa and the Caribbean, is flattened into a horror movie prop: pins, dolls, and cackling curses. Even the show's own internal logic works against the episode in hindsight. The professor, established over dozens of prior episodes as the voice of reason who debunks every supposed curse and superstition the skipper panics about, is the one character the witch doctor successfully overpowers. Turning the show's rational, scientific mind into a shuffling zombie isn't just a fun visual gag. Narratively, it's the writers admitting that in this particular story, science loses. The episode briefly entertains the idea that the skipper's superstition was right all along, only to resolve the whole thing not through logic but through Ginger performing an entirely different, equally invented native dance borrowed from another fictional island altogether. 2 different manufactured cultures are mashed together and treated as interchangeable, which somewhat undercuts any claim that the episode is engaging with these traditions seriously rather than just raiding them for costume ideas. Then there's the detail that tends to surprise even longtime fans. In the episode's original ending, after the witch doctor is finally driven off the island, Gilligan gets his own petty revenge by carving a doll in the witch doctor's likeness and jabbing it with a pin, at which point the witch doctor, now far offshore, yelps in pain and swims away even faster. It's a small, almost throwaway final gag. But that closing scene has been quietly absent from the version of Voodoo that circulated in later syndication packages, trimmed out for time or content long before anyone was having public conversations about representation on classic television. Whether that particular cut was originally about runtime, standards and practices squeamishness, or something more sensitive is genuinely unclear, and honest fans of the show will tell you they don't fully know either. The paper trail on small syndication trims like this one rarely survives the decades the way the episodes themselves do. What is clear is that the episode as a whole sits on a very short list of installments that rarely get pulled out for anniversary specials, and when it does surface, it's almost always with a raised eyebrow rather than a nostalgic smile. It's telling that this wasn't even the show's first attempt at a voodoo storyline. An earlier first-season episode had already used the word as shorthand for any unexplained bad luck on the island, treating an entire religious tradition as a punchline so casually that the writers apparently felt comfortable returning to the same well a second time 2 years later, this time with an actual costumed witch doctor attached to it. Of the 3 episodes on this list, Gilligan's mother-in-law is the one that tends to make even devoted fans wince the hardest, and it doesn't need any Cold War context or supernatural subplot to explain why. The premise alone does the work. A boat finally arrives near the island, but the only way the castaways can secure safe passage off it is if Gilligan agrees to marry the daughter of the local tribal chief, a young woman the episode's own script treats as a punchline built entirely around her size, going out of its way to frame her as a burden Gilligan must physically as well as socially put up with. The comedy is structured almost entirely around one joke repeated in different costumes, that marrying her would be a fate worse than staying shipwrecked forever. Strip away the jungle setting and the laugh track, and what's left is a story that stacks 2 different kinds of stereotyping on top of each other at the same time. There's the body shaming, which plays a woman's appearance for cruelty rather than character, treating her weight as the entire joke rather than one detail among many, right down to the episode's title, which frames the entire premise as a horror comedy about acquiring an unwanted mother-in-law rather than a story about 2 people at all. And there's the ethnic stereotyping layered underneath it, the same island bride trope the series leaned on repeatedly, in which native characters exist almost exclusively as either threats to be escaped or prizes to be avoided, never as people with interior lives, names the audience is meant to remember, or motivations beyond the plot mechanics of the week. What makes the episode sting a little more than some of the show's other native tribe stories is how casually cruel the framing is toward everyone involved, not just the antagonists. The other castaways don't push back on the premise or question whether marrying someone off against her will to secure a boat ride is a reasonable plan. They treat it as a logistics problem to be solved, debating tactics for getting Gilligan out of the wedding the same way they debate how to fix a leaky raft. The chief's daughter herself is never given a real voice in her own storyline. She's a plot obstacle with a face, present in the episode primarily so Gilligan has someone to be visibly reluctant about. It's a structure the show would return to more than once, but rarely as bluntly as it does here, which is part of why this particular episode tends to draw the most uncomfortable reactions from modern audiences revisiting the series for the first time in years. Put those 2 things together in a single half hour, and you get an episode that doesn't just feel dated the way a haircut or a slang term feels dated. It feels actively unkind in a way that's hard to laugh along with today, regardless of how broad and cartoonish the rest of the show's humor tends to be. It's the rare Gilligan's Island episode where the joke isn't really about the absurdity of being shipwrecked at all. It's about a woman's body and a stranger's culture, and neither one of those was ever the show's strong suit to begin with. It's worth saying plainly, none of these 3 episodes were ever pulled by an act of Congress, and there's no official document anywhere with